Hello, and welcome to Dispatch Live. It's Tuesday, July 11th. We haven't been here in 2 weeks now because we took 4th of July off last week. We hope you all had a wonderful holiday, ate a lot of meat, and loved your country. Kevin should be joining us soon. There he is. But we've got a great hour lined up today. Kevin Williamson, Mike Warren, and Audrey Fallberg will join us a little bit later to talk about some of her reporting from the campaign trail. But we're going to start with a piece that Kevin is working on that will be live on the site tomorrow, I believe.
After, I think.
Dispatch Live viewers are going to get a sneak peek of coming attractions, but it involves a upcoming Supreme Court case. Obviously, we just finished the 2022 fall term. All those decisions were handed down over the past month or so, and people are starting to look ahead at what's coming down the pike. So, Kevin, could you talk a little bit about the Rahimi case and kind of how it might not be as simple as some descriptions might have you believe?
Yeah, the case has generated a lot of very stupid headlines, some of which I'll share with you. I've got one here that was just a really pretty typical one, but now I seem to have lost it. Man, that's embarrassing. Anyway, it's here it is. The Supreme Court will decide if abusive spouses have a right to own guns, says Vox. And several other headlines have been written the same way, that the Supreme Court is seriously considering giving domestic abusers the right to keep and bear arms and that sort of thing. That's not really what the case is about, although there is a domestic violence angle to it. So there's this guy who is apparently just a real piece of work. He was, according to the police down in Arlington, Texas, involved in at least 5 shootings over the course of about 5.5 weeks, including one of him just getting mad because his friend's credit card got declined at a Whataburger, and he pulled out a gun and just started letting loose. Shot at a constable.
That's how you know it's a Texas story.
It's a Whataburger, so you got to get your Whata Chick nuggets or whatever they are. And he shot at a constable. I think got into a car wreck and just opened fire on the other party in the car wreck. And he was accused by a former girlfriend of having assaulted her. And in that particular episode, he entered into a civil protection from abuse, restraining order voluntarily in that case. And all the stuff he's apparently done, the police describe him as a drug dealer, although he's never really been charged with a drug crime. The only thing he was ever convicted for that was a serious crime was being in possession of a firearm while under a restraining order that prohibits you from having a firearm, which is a federal offense. And he was sentenced to 6 years for that. His lawyers challenged the case 2 times, once before the Bruen decision and once after. And after the Bruen decision, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals decided that the federal law prohibiting people from owning a firearm if they're subject to a restraining order is not constitutional. And there's a long kind of legal argument for why that is. But the sort of basic issue is that this is the result of a civil procedure, not the result of a criminal trial or criminal case, anything like that. There's no conviction. He wasn't even charged with the crime. And so what the Supreme Court will be deciding is whether legislatures can actually limit the Second Amendment in that way. And under the Bruen standards, the Fifth Circuit seems to think they can't, but the Supreme Court will come up with that. So it's an interesting case to me because, there's the sort of narrow legal questions that I don't really speak to very much because that's not my background. And you've got Sarah and David and other people to talk about that stuff. But I think it's interesting as a sort of civic question about what kind of society you're going to have. And I really think there's reason to be concerned about a precedent that says you can be stripped of basic constitutional rights without a trial, without the standards of evidence and due process that would be involved in getting a felony conviction or involved in being declared mentally incompetent by a judge and committed to a mental institution or something like that. In this particular case, there was not even a formal hearing. The hearing was waived. He didn't have counsel, anything like that. It's a pretty flimsy process. And in Texas, typically a restraining order like that expires after 2 years, but theoretically, a judge can give you a lifetime restraining order in a situation like that. So I worry about having a body of legal assumptions that says we can treat constitutional rights that way. Obviously, we wouldn't treat the First Amendment that way. We wouldn't treat the Fourth Amendment that way. We wouldn't treat the rest of the Bill of Rights that way. There's this long-standing issue about the Second Amendment being treated as sort of a second-rate civil right. One of the concurring judges in this case, Judge Ho, gets into that sort of more explicitly. And but yeah, I think there is a good argument that that we should have the same high standards for the Second Amendment that we have for everyone else, or every other constitutional amendment, every other constitutional protection like that. That being said, I'm not 100% convinced that the law in question is unconstitutional. As I indicate in the piece, there are different levels of process that are involved in truncating people's Second Amendment rights. Sometimes it has to be a felony conviction, but also there are temporary revocations of rights. For instance, if you've been indicted, some of those procedures that have lower standards of process and evidence are, in my view, not as objectionable in that they've got an expiration date built in. If you've been indicted, you're either going to be convicted or you're going to be acquitted. It may go on for a long time, but there's a way out of it. There's an appeals process. There's other sorts of things. Whereas in this particular matter, where it's just a civil process and not even a real hearing or anything like that, I think that's pretty worrisome. Yeah, so that's where that case is. But you can bet that every story you read about this there's a really, really bad piece of Slate that I take apart a little bit in my piece, is going to be about, this is the Supreme Court taking the side of domestic abusers and making sure that they can have firearms. The headline was particularly dumb in the sense that as a legal question, the guy's not a domestic abuser. He's never been charged with it, much less convicted of it. Now, there's no reason to doubt, I think, the stories that we've heard about this. But thinking that someone's a bad person, having heard that someone's a bad person, believing on pretty good authority that someone's a rotten guy is not the same as someone being convicted in a court of law or even indicted in a court of law. And I think that really should be our real gold standard for that sort of thing.
I want to read a section from this piece that's going to go up again on the site tomorrow, and everybody should read the whole thing. But
I don't think it's going to go up tomorrow, actually. I think it's going to go up on Thursday.
Okay. Well, I think you kind of make a very nuanced point here, so you say, what kind of society do we want to have? Obviously, we want to be a society in which it's very difficult for goons like Rahimi to get their hands on weapons. We want to be a society that takes violence against women seriously. But we also want and should want to be a society in which people who have not been convicted of a crime have their civil rights curtailed only in the most extraordinary of circumstances. So, you kind of go on to continue in the piece that there are other ways where if we don't want this guy, Rahimi, to have a gun, there are plenty of non-controversial means they could have arrested him for shooting up a water.
The laws we have against shooting at people, for instance.
Exactly. So I know this is a hobby horse of yours and also of Sarah's, but enforcing existing gun laws that are already on the books. And had he been arrested for any of those myriad other crimes, then how would this process have played out differently?
Yeah, that's a real issue. In Philadelphia, which I've written about a lot, assuming you even get charged in a gun possession case, a simple illegal possession case, your chances of being convicted are something like, I want to say it's 1 in 9. Something like that. Your chances of actually going to jail are maybe 1 in 15 or 1 in 17, something like that. So we don't really enforce that stuff very strongly. We don't do it very well at the local level in most cases. We don't do it very well at the federal level in most cases. We've got a longstanding thing of they call lie and try, of people who are prohibited from buying a firearm who still go into a gun shop anyway and try to buy one and go through the ATF paperwork and all that stuff. We almost never charge anybody in those situations. We don't charge people who lie on the ATF paperwork very often. We don't even make an effort to recover the guns in most cases. ATF has put out some information about this that's contradictory, maybe incomplete, but it looks like from what I've looked at, in the majority of cases, there's no real effort made to recover the firearms when they know that a sale's been made wrongly. In one case that I was looking at, they labeled the file as resolved, and what they had done was they sent the guy a text message and said, "Hey, you probably shouldn't do this. Don't do it again." And if I could go out and commit federal felonies all day and the result would be a text message from the Fed saying, "Don't do that again," I would have a very different kind of life.
Yes. I want to keep talking about Supreme Court. First, we have a lot of questions, Kevin, about your facial hair or lack thereof in the chat.
Circle of life, it comes, it goes, and
it'll come back. I do. It's kind of the.
If you put up a poll, by the way, I will have you killed.
It's the reverse Chip Roy, because he grew up. This is a congressman from Texas. He grew up in Maryland, Bethesda, and then while he was there and he was working as a DC Hill staffer, he was very clean shaven and looked like somebody from Maryland. And then he moves to Texas, and now if you look at a picture of him, he's got probably the most Texas facial hair of anybody in Congress. So
what does very Texas facial hair look like, I wonder? Is it like we're talking like Taliban Old Testament kind of thing, or
a little ZZ Top?
Sam,
like if ZZ Top stopped after 6 months instead of however many years it took them to get to that.
By the way, the irony of ZZ Top is that the one band member whose name was Frank Beard was the one band member who did not have a beard.
That's right.
Yes.
They replaced their late bass player, Dusty Hill, with a guy who's got a big long beard who had been his, I guess, tech and roadie. So they had a bearded bass player like in the wings waiting for when they had to tap him and bring him in.
Michael, the Supreme Court, obviously we're talking about a future case, but we've just wrapped up several high profile ones. It's becoming kind of it's becoming a 2024 issue. Both, Biden is obviously going to make running on another 4 years so that he can appoint more justices, not necessarily pack the court. He's pushed back on the progressives within his own party on that issue. But after each of these decisions, these high profile decisions that have gone against the administration's wishes, come out and say either, quote, I think one of them was, "This is not a normal court." A couple other things about how we need to elect more Democrats so that we can get back like-minded justices on the court. And then on the Republican side, we saw an interesting op-ed from Mitch McConnell, Senate Majority Leader, earlier this week, either in the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, trying to paint the court as it's a centrist court. It's not ideological. It's fairly moderate. Obviously, one side seems to be happier with the results lately than others, but kind of how have you seen the Supreme Court playing out on the campaign trail? Are candidates talking about it? Are they generally happy with how things have played out over the last couple months?
Yeah, I mean, Republicans love it. And, I know we'll talk about it later in the show, but I spent several days with Mike Pence last week in Iowa, and he brings it up. He's running against Donald Trump. But one of the things he touts from the Trump-Pence administration, that's what he always says, is how about those 3 Supreme Court justices? And that always gets a big round of applause. Look, the politics, to go back to the first part of your question, Declan, about Joe Biden and Democrats trying to get Democrats to be Supreme Court voters. I think it's going to be hard. And if you actually talk, and I've talked in past years, this was before Dobbs, but that I was talking with a few Democratic strategists about this, but I believe the Dobbs decision had been leaked. There was a sense that it was coming. Mm-hmm. And they were talking about this ahead of the 2022 midterms. They said, it's really hard to get our voters, meaning Democratic voters, motivated on the Supreme Court. Obviously, people are motivated on issues like abortion. They're going to be motivated on some of these other social issues that, in their view, the court has gone too far on. But you have to really appreciate, and I think it's worth appreciating how much work and how much sort of um, how much has been built up on the Republican side, on the conservative side, to condition Republican voters to think of the Supreme Court, to think of the lower courts, to think of judicial nominations as an issue in which they're paying attention. The reason it's a Republican, it's an issue that there's some elasticity for voters. They want to know what your view is on judges. Is just look at what Donald Trump did in 2016. He felt that in order to win in 2016, to win over Republican voters in a general election, he needed to move toward conservatives, judicial conservatives, and that's why he released the list that he basically received from Leonard Leo, the head of the Federalist Society. And he said, yes, I will pick from this list. I mean, in a way, it was the most successful part of the conservative movement of the past 40 plus years, was building a coalition of voters. Democrats don't have that. It doesn't mean they can't. It doesn't mean in specific places, specific states, specific situations, they can't benefit politically from the feeling that the Supreme Court is out of line with big D democratic values. But I think it's going to take a few elections. It's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take a lot of training, because voters need to be trained to think about issues and think about how important they are. You can't flip a switch, which I think some Democrats think they can do. You can't flip a switch and make them suddenly realize this is important. It's going to be something I'm watching. I have other thoughts on the McConnell op-ed and this idea, but I feel like that's enough for me right now.
Mike, if you don't mind me just jumping in there for a second,
sure.
There's a kind of a dynamic there that I think is interesting, that shapes how this works out politically, which is that, the kind of originalist, if you will, conservative version of Supreme Court jurisprudence has the effect in many cases of throwing decisions back to the states, as with abortion, for instance. And I think it's difficult for Democrats to get their people really motivated about abortion as a national political issue in the long term, because so many of their voters live in places where abortion rights either aren't going to change at all, or they're actually going to become more liberal, as they probably are in California and Connecticut and New Jersey and a few other places. So it's one thing to say to, the kind of Fairfield County upper middle class Democratic voters, you have to protect your abortion rights, and they'll certainly do that. But you have to protect abortion rights for people in some rural county in Mississippi where you're never going to go and never have heard of and care about only in sort of theory. I think it's going to be a very different kind of thing. Whereas left-wing kind of activist jurisprudence tends to have the opposite effect of putting one-size-fits-all solution on the whole country, whether it's with abortion or whether it's with getting the Second Amendment or other sorts of things. And so you've always got kind of a national center-right movement in opposition to that. Of course, the other part about that was really super effective on Leonard Leo's part was when the Republicans nominate an intellectually lazy man and you offer to do his homework for him, that's a great strategy. You couldn't do that with Barack Obama, who's not going to sit around and let other people make his choices for him.
That's right. It was something that that Trump didn't care about, frankly.
Right.
It was a means to an end, to the end being winning the election. And it does, just if I could dwell on that point for just a second more, I have heard, and I've been sort of in and out of conservative media for the past 15 years of my career. I've been around kind of the conservative world, and I've seen how since Trump came on the scene, there's been a lot of talk about what is the conservative movement conserved? What has really been accomplished over the last several decades? What did Ronald Reagan ever really do?
Is the Georgia Bar Association infiltrated by Freemasons?
But putting that aside, I always think, there's a lesson in the Federalist Society and the judicial, the conservative sort of judicial movement, that a lot of the other parts of the conservative movement ought to look to. They played a long game, and they're successful, and conservatives should be happy with that, not looking for those shortcuts. And Democrats, frankly, would be good to take those lessons as well. They've got to build up. There was a moment, and it was about 10 years ago, which is somewhat related, which is Democrats got very smart on understanding that actually the state AGs are a place where we ought to be playing more. And they started investing a lot of money into electing state AGs, because that's who brings a lot of cases. That's where a lot of the political fights that Democrats felt like they were losing, that they could win. It's all about seeing where the opportunity is and thinking long term. If we can invest and get people, voters, and of course elected officials thinking about the issues we care about, it's not going to work out for us tomorrow, but on the long tail. And again, it's such a success of the conservative legal movement.
And the fact that it doesn't work out quickly is, in a sense, the good news, right? I mean, I know, like with abortion,
Yes.
for instance, it took 50 years to turn that around. And during the 50 years, a lot of bad stuff happened. But the reason it's a game of decades is because we live in a stable democratic country. And if
Yes.
you live in a stable democratic country, it takes a long time to make radical social changes.
And to touch a little bit on what we mentioned earlier with this Mitch McConnell op-ed, I think another challenge the Democrats will have is that a lot of these decisions that very, very partisan Democrats and the hyper online media types are very upset about are not actually all that unpopular nationwide, and it's harder to build kind of a dramatic consensus. The Roberts Court, our colleague Sarah was talking about this the other day, has actually overturned precedent less than any other Supreme Court over the past century. So the Berger Court, the Warren Court, and so it's going to be difficult to kind of make the case that this is as extreme of a court, especially when you see polling numbers of like 70% of Americans don't want race to be considered in college admissions, and things like that. That's the kind of argument that Mitch McConnell is making, is that, look, this court sided against the quote unquote Republican position on the Voting Rights Act and some of these other high profile cases. The independent state legislature theory, I don't necessarily know that needs to be a Republican or Democratic issue, but it was brought by Republicans in this case. And this court obviously is the same one that struck down all of Donald Trump's challenges that made it before the court back in 2020 after that election. So it's not a Republican rubber stamp in the way that you often hear it as. And then even these positions, obviously, the jury is still being written on kind of the long-term popularity of the Dobbs decision and where all these states are going to shake out. But I think, as the point that Kevin makes, states are allowed to kind of figure out their own regimes and move from there. It's not going to be as salient of an issue. Mike, what you said, you had some thoughts earlier about McConnell and kind of how he's positioning the court vis-a-vis 2024.
Well, you expressed actually much of what my thoughts were, which is that McConnell is essentially right. And McConnell is a political animal, so I don't want to extend him too much of the benefit of the doubt here. But I believe, when it comes to his view of what the court should be, I believe he is principled on it. And it's something that I think a lot of liberals in the media, or just Democratic voters, really still don't grok about conservatives. And Donald Trump doesn't quite grok it either, which is that judicial conservatives love process, and they love the process to work the way the process should. And frankly, even more liberal or progressive or Democratic judges, even people like Elena Kagan, I mean, have a respect for process. And it is somewhat like, if you're trying to graft on, when you try to graft on American political debates on a country like Sri Lanka, where none of the same things really work, you can take that too far when you're trying to apply political metaphors to the Supreme Court, because there obviously is some politics going on with some of these decisions. You can't separate it entirely, but it really is a place where, with the sort of originalist jurisprudence as firmly in place, where process matters so much more than outcomes. Democrats don't believe that, but it's true. Just talk to anybody from the Federalist Society. That's what they care about. Most of them do.
Right. It's pretty silly for Joe Biden and the White House to come out with a statement praising the court on, I forget what day it was, on Wednesday, for the independent state legislature theory decision. This is the right decision. It upholds democracy, blah, 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 blah. And then a day later, a decision that they disagree with. This is not a normal court. We need to sometimes it goes your way, sometimes it doesn't. And obviously there's these fights here, but
progressives sometimes they end up being sort of shocked when the law's on their side. I think about, the reaction to Clarence Thomas in the marijuana case, and, where he said, well, it's you can't really use the interstate commerce clause to regulate things that aren't interstate or commerce. And it's not as though, Clarence Thomas is this guy who's sitting around saying, man, I really care about weed. And I really want to make sure as many people get their hands on weed as possible. And people who think of the court as being only, a political exercise of power, get really confused by the fact that sometimes these people just look at the law and say, well, here's what the law says. It's interesting in this recent court because of the sort of expansive rulings on the powers of Native American tribes, which doesn't really map onto our political divisions that neatly either. I think that's really confused and surprised some people.
We only have a couple minutes left in this segment, but we can wrap on, Kevin, you ended your piece that again is coming Thursday, not Wednesday, but with the Man for All Seasons quote.
It's inevitable. It's all over the place. Yeah.
Yes. So can you fill our listeners in on kind of what that is again, and why it's so important that we have these process arguments, even if somebody's really, really, really bad and we want to go get them, and we just know that they're wrong and deserve to be in jail.
Well, I won't rehash the film clip because we've done that 11 times in 11 different contexts, probably in the last 11 weeks. Dispatch is one of those movies and plays that everybody seems to love, although maybe not as much as Jonah loves The Godfather. But the idea, of course, is that there's a difference between what happens under the law and what happens in your broader sense of what's good and bad. And so where people go wrong is they look at a situation and say, well, that's bad, so therefore the law must be against it. But the question really is, what does the law actually say about that? There are all sorts of bad things in a society, including our society, that aren't necessarily illegal. Maybe there are things that should be illegal, but aren't. It's not the job of the court to come out and say, well, the law doesn't actually say this, but this is a rotten thing and this guy's a rotten guy, so we're going to pretend like the law says that, because that gets us to the outcome that we want. What Mike was talking about earlier with the question of procedure versus the question of outcomes. If you live in a society with the rule of law, then questions of justice under law are questions of procedure, not questions of outcomes. And it used to be kind of an uncontroversial thing for people to say that, well, I'd rather 10 men go free who are guilty than one innocent man be convicted. And that was because people really cared about the legal process. But I think now you're seeing maybe a little bit of civil amnesia about that, where that commitment doesn't seem to be as strong among people as it once was.
Pessimistic note to end on, but probably probably accurate. So yes, well, thank you so much for joining us, Kevin. You're going to be replaced in the window.
Not replaced.
Yes.
No one can replace him.
Yes. Audrey has joined us.
I'm not even sure Audrey would like the idea of replacing me.
Can never replace Kevin.
No. Welcome, Audrey. Thank you for joining Dispatch Live. We're gonna shift gears a little bit to the 2024 both presidential and down ballot races for the next half hour here, and then obviously again, all viewers can feel free to send some questions for us in the chat. We've got our producer Victoria forwarding those along. So Mike, you have a piece that's coming. It is coming tomorrow. Okay, so you were in Iowa the past week or so,
yes.
And you have come back with wisdom about the the most interesting candidate in the race. So why don't you fill us in on who that is?
Man, I really raised the bar there of expectation. No, I think I said earlier a few minutes ago that I spent it with Pence, and Mike Pence, the former vice president, at the moment at least, is to me the most interesting, or one of the most interesting candidates in the field. And it's not because he blows your socks off with his soaring rhetoric or
Speak for yourself, man.
or he's not holding giant rallies, but my takeaway is that he's doing something different than pretty much every Republican candidate for president in the race, and to me that makes him interesting. We're going to set aside Chris Christie for a little bit. He's also doing something interesting, which is going after Donald Trump, and basically anybody who doesn't go after Donald Trump. That seems to be Christie's lane, but let's set him aside here because he's got a very specific lane. What you're seeing, if you're not Donald Trump and you're running as a Republican, there's a lot of kind of folks trying to take on the mantle of Trumpism and fit it into their own persona or their own political brand. You can sort of see Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, kind of claiming, or his acolytes claiming, he's even more Trump than Trump. You get that a little bit from Vivek Ramaswamy. Maybe he's a younger, more millennial version of Trump, but he literally wears the same solid red tie and blue suit that Trump does. And he even has a hat that says truth. It kind of looks like a MAGA hat. And then you've got, people like Tim Scott and Nikki Haley, who are all kind of trying to figure out where they fit in a new Trumpified Republican Party. And what I found Mike Pence is doing is not really doing that. It's not to say he's disavowing Trumpism entirely, particularly on trade and immigration. He sort of seems to have accepted that the conservative movement or the conservative project has taken a slightly more populist position on economic trade and immigration, which was always sort of within the realm of what conservatives were interested in. Maybe less so on the protectionism, but definitely on the anti-illegal immigration. But Pence is basically running his campaign with a kind of policy-heavy argument that conservatives haven't really changed that much on some big issues. And he really focuses, at least in the last week in Iowa, he focused on three of them. He focused on government spending and size of government. He really talks a lot about spending. He cites himself as a sort of relatively young conservative backbencher in the House in the first part of the George W. Bush administration, fighting against spending cuts, fighting against the expansion of the education department with No Child Left Behind. So on government spending, he basically says we need to curb spending. We need to deal with the national debt by, get this, reforming entitlements like Social Security and Medicare. I mean, he says this and embraces it. He's not asked about it and sort of sheepishly says, yeah, I do think we need to reform them. He makes it a part of his stump speech. This is something Donald Trump said, ain't no way, ain't no how we're going to do. So on that issue, on the life issue, he really, Mike Pence really pushes the point that conservatives and Republicans are pro-life, and Dobbs doesn't change that. And he argues that Donald Trump is essentially backing away from that commitment now that Dobbs has overturned Roe v. Wade. Pence says no, that's not where the Republican Party should be. And then finally on foreign policy, and particularly Pence has been talking about Ukraine and the need for the United States to embrace Ukraine and its fight against Vladimir Putin and Russian aggression. He was there a few days before I saw him in Iowa. He was in Ukraine, I believe the first Republican presidential candidate this cycle to do that. And he has essentially argued kind of from the right, from an internationalist right of center perspective against the Biden administration for dragging its feet on not providing enough munitions quickly enough. And on that, he really is also in opposition and rejects the kind of Trumpian view. And so the story to me is that he's making this case. He's making the case that Republicans are more traditionally conservative than people seem to think, that they're a little tired of Trumpism, and that Pence is standing here, waiting for them to come to him. Whether or not that's going to be a successful political strategy for Pence, I'm not quite ready to say it will be, but it's interesting, and that's why I wrote the story.
It's super great. I hope everybody takes a couple minutes to read it tomorrow.
Thanks.
It does seem to me almost as if, like, and you described this a little bit, everybody in the race is running, orbiting around Trump in some way or another, whether it's like Vivek Ramaswamy trying to mimic him, or DeSantis trying to mimic him, or Chris Christie or Asa Hutchinson kind of in opposition, defining themselves against what Donald Trump stands for and is doing. And Pence is just kind of like off on his own, orbiting some other principles, maybe something like that. And almost as if Trump doesn't exist, which is strange given the fact that, he spent 4 years as his vice president. But
well, and I will say this: he does not shy away on the trail from disagreeing or denouncing Trump on these issues on which he disagrees with them. And the other thing that I picked up on was January 6th, how much that is a defining moment for Pence, not just for him, because he talks about it. He says, the president and I will never agree on that day. He was wrong to push me to overturn the election. He was wrong then. He's still wrong today. It's not just that. And Pence essentially says, here I stand. This is the stand that I took. But I was impressed with how many voters I talked with who brought up January 6th in the context of Mike Pence as a positive, unprompted. I wasn't asking them. I was just asking, what do you like or dislike about Mike Pence? Almost every voter I talked to brought up what he did on January 6th and said he did it even though he was getting pressured. So while he's off in his own orbit, he is still defined by Trump, but he's in a way trying to transcend Trump. And he has this opening to do so because of January 6th in a way that you would not think a former vice president would have against his former running mate. He's almost been liberated by what happened on January 6th.
Yeah, it took him a little while to come around to this perspective, but you've kind of seen over the past 2.5 years or whatever it's been, that walking further and further and further out on that branch, being willing to say, no, I did what was right, and Trump was wrong, and he's still wrong. Audrey, I want to wrap you in here, but quick, Michael, just to put a bow on the Pence piece. What are his advisors saying the path is here? Obviously, Iowa is incredibly important for any future momentum that he hopes to build. If he doesn't win Iowa, is that the ball game? He seems like he's built in a lab to perform well in that state.
Let's see. What they actually say is they have to do well in Iowa. This is what Pence told me when I asked him last week. I said, do you have to win Iowa? He said, we have to do well, which is an admission from a campaign to say, you have to do well. But I use my very special candidate speak transmogrifier translator to push that through and maybe have some influence from an analysis from people around Mike Pence who say, yes, he has to win Iowa. It doesn't mean that he will drop out if he doesn't win Iowa. But I think it's pretty clear he launched his campaign in Iowa. He views the evangelical base, which delivered surprise Iowa caucus wins in 2008 to Mike Huckabee and in 2012 to Rick Santorum, and in some ways in 2016 to Ted Cruz. That block of voters delivered the caucuses. He's counting on that group. He's also trying to cobble that together with a group that those other voters didn't really have, which were mainstream Republicans, the kind of people who were coming up to me and saying, I really like what Mike Pence did on January 6th. it's just, there's a lot of competition for that right now. Will he have the money? That's another question. We still haven't seen what he raised in the second quarter. He was only in it for 4 weeks as a candidate, but it's not going to be easy.
And speaking of Iowa, it is important to remember that we now have a date, Martin Luther King Jr. Day. That is the day of the Iowa caucuses. So this thing is really coming up quickly.
January 15th,
That'll
2024.
be, I think that's the earliest it's been in like a decade, right?
Yes.
So Audrey, speaking of competition for Mike Pence and speaking of money, we've seen some interesting stories the past couple of days trickling out about the desperate lengths some campaigns are going to fundraise ahead of obviously the RNC has implemented these strict requirements or thresholds to reach the debates. And part of that is having, I think it's 40,000 individual donors. Doesn't matter how much money they're giving, but individual donors across a certain number of states. What have the Ramaswamy and Doug Burgum campaigns been doing to help reach that threshold?
Yeah, it's interesting because both of these guys are both very personally wealthy, and they're begging people for money. But as we describe in our newsletter tomorrow, and a little blurb about this, it's $1 million effort to make this RNC presidential debate stage. Burgum is basically offering a $20 gift card to each of the first 50,000 people who donate at least $1 to his campaign. And I just love these campaign emails because, as you said, they're extremely desperate. Burgum reads, "We're not asking for money. We want to send you money," which is just really awesome.
That's a great return on investment, by the way.
Yeah.
You donate $1, you get $20 back.
Yeah. And then Ramaswamy, who's polling in, I think, 4th place now behind Mike Pence. So Mike Pence is in 3rd, as Mike points out in his piece tomorrow. Ramaswamy, who's in 4th, is basically saying he's launching this program to pay grassroots supporters 10% of any money they raise for his campaign if they share this link and get other people to get their friends to donate, basically. So there's just people really grabbing for straws here to try to get on that debate stage. And it also just really exemplifies how much Trump really rules the small dollar fundraising game. It's really tough for other candidates to compete on that front.
Can I say real quick, Declan?
Yeah.
I saw Doug Burgum last week in Iowa on the day before 4th of July. He was marching in the West. I guess he was riding in a car in the West Des Moines, Iowa 4th of July parade. And I asked him if he was going to be at the debate, and he said that they plan on it. So just a little, there's some shoe leather reporting to support what Audrey's been talking about.
He is, I forget exactly where he made his money, but he's extraordinarily wealthy. This is the
he's a programmer. He's
Yes.
Burgum, the governor of North Dakota. He sold his company in I think the late 90s or early 2000s to Microsoft.
Yeah.
So
it's he just needs to convert that $800 million or whatever he has into 40,000 $1 donations, and he's willing to spend $50 million to do it. So
that's a lot of gift cards you got to carry in your hand from Target. You got to pull all the ones off the shelves.
And
Audrey, what do you make of, like, is this how campaigns should be run? What, like, obviously the RNC is getting pushback about the pledge that you have to support the Republican nominee, and candidates are obviously frustrated about these requirements too. Do you think is the RNC handling this kind of the correct way to make sure that we don't have these double debate, junior debate situations playing out with 20 candidates?
Well, what I will say is maybe this will kind of narrow down the field a little bit, which might be good. I know that a lot of people are kind of worried that we're seeing what we saw in 2016. And, some people really might not qualify. And I think that, as we reported earlier this week, Chris Sununu, governor of New Hampshire, is saying that, once we're in November, December, getting closer to the first primaries and caucuses, people are going to start, high profile Republicans are going to start exerting pressure on folks to drop out. But, this might be a way for people to actually just not be able to qualify a little bit on the earlier end. So we'll see.
And while we're talking about fields winnowing. Some other fields on lower ballot races are growing. We've got a couple people jumping into the race. Sam Brown is one in Nevada. And then we're seeing the Ohio Senate race field is continuing to grow. A couple others. Audrey, what are you hearing about the Republicans' efforts to make sure that they're fielding the best candidates that they can heading into 2024 on the Senate side?
Well, I heard part of the first conversation that you guys had with Kevin earlier, and I heard Mike say a phrase about how McConnell is a political animal, and he certainly is. And he had this great quote in Politico today. Let me see if I can find the exact quote, or somebody can pull it up for me. But I mean, he is extremely focused on winning the Senate this cycle, right? After a disaster cycle for Republicans, where kind of a failure to recruit really strong candidates who could fundraise and compete with Democrats, they are stuck with the Democratic Senate. So, McConnell was very intent on getting a Senate campaign chief who will recruit strong candidates who can preferably help pay for their own races really, really early on in the race. And so I think we saw that in Montana. I think it was last week when Tim Sheehy, this really decorated military veteran, jumped into the race in Montana to take on Tester, a state that John Tester's a Democratic senator, but Trump won that state by, I think, like 16 points last cycle. So this is a very red state. Tester's extremely vulnerable. And, as soon as he jumps into the race, NRC chairman Steve Daines immediately endorsed him, gets a bunch of other senators to endorse him. So it's not just talk, like he's getting other senators to really commit behind him. And the NRC is very committed to winning that state. And we're going to see that in several other states, which we can get to in a second too.
Yeah, I think this is a break from the NRSC in previous cycles in terms of how early and how forcefully they're coming out in favor of some of these candidates. That's it's been kind of oscillating, in 2012 and 2010, there were a lot of whiffs. And then in 2014, the NRSC plays a slightly bigger role in ensuring that the most electable candidates make it through. Then there's some backsliding. We nominate Blake Masters and Herschel Walker and these candidates that dramatically underperform given kind of where the trajectory of the midterm cycle is supposed to have the opposition party. And so now they're trying to kind of clamp the reins down again. What we got a question from a listener here. Let me pull it up. How effective? This was something that we talked about a lot leading into 2022. Was like, is Mitch McConnell and the NRSC backing somebody? Is that helping or hurting a candidate in the primary when you're in such a populist moment? And oftentimes these candidates are running against McConnell and the establishments, quote unquote.
That's a really great question. We actually had a really funny off the record meeting with a really high profile Republican senator a couple months ago. And his line was, he always tells candidates, I'll do whatever is more helpful, like endorse you publicly or just completely stay out of the race. And I think, frankly, McConnell is a really smart political animal, but he is, seen as the establishment. And so, like, really Trumpy candidates will often use a line, oh, well, that's just McConnell's handpicked candidate, which Matt Rosendale, who's a current Republican representative, a congressman from Montana, who ran against Tester in 2018, lost by about 3.5 points, and is really strongly considering jumping into that Republican primary. So he would definitely be tough for Sheehy to beat, and he'd probably have the backing of the Club for Growth. Anyway, point is, McConnell is somebody who, is pretty controversial, especially like on the Trumpy wing of the party. So I think he tries to stay as quiet as he can. But I think Steve Daines is kind of new to the role, and I think is able to kind of walk that line a little bit better than somebody like McConnell because he hasn't been around as much. I don't know. What do you think, Mike?
Well, look, I think they view this, the McConnell world views this as Trump, which in 2022, those candidates who did not do well, who became the nominees and did not do well, were by and large supported or even essentially handpicked by Donald Trump. I think they view this as whether it's Donald Trump or the Club for Growth, which is opposed to Donald Trump on many other things. So there's a lot of kind of everybody kind of hates each other in this family. But the McConnell view is we're going to play because everybody else is playing. And you let the chips fall where they may. I do think that there is still some power when the Senate leader, the Senate Republican leader, puts his thumb on the scale. That is a signal to donors. It's a signal to other candidates. Candidates will see that and think twice about jumping in if they're on the fence. It may encourage some to jump in even more, but there are a lot that probably we never hear about who see that telegraph of support and think, well, that's the guy. So I think McConnell world sees this as worth playing because, hey, Trump and everybody else is playing the game as well.
We one of these candidates, that Audrey, who you just mentioned, Sheehy, there was just a story a couple hours ago, right before we got on, with some of his old, like 2005 era Facebook posts. I don't want to talk about the details of them specifically. There's just some weird pictures and captions and whatnot, but more broadly, we are now getting to the age where every political candidate is going to have really, really embarrassing social media from like the early aughts. Are we just going to have to do like a blanket amnesty? Nobody can attack anybody else about their 2007 Facebook updates, or how are we going to navigate this as a political and media sphere? Audrey, you're lucky. You were past the worst of it.
Yeah, well, my friend Brian Metzger at Business Insider isn't what it's called now. He wrote that story, and I love Brian, but this was just kind of a funny story because, as you mentioned, I think like we're getting to this point where everybody's going to have this issue, and not that Twitter is an indicator of literally anything at all, but all of the tweet replies and quote tweets are like, dudes rock, like this doesn't matter at all, like what's the point of this? We
should give some context. These were Facebook posts, pictures, racy pictures, and some comments that were not exactly gentlemanly toward some women in the photos that Sheehy and some of his friends, again in college, were posting.
Yeah, I think in general, we're just getting to this point where everybody knows too much about each other and people should stop posting so much online.
Yeah.
Here.
And it's kind of like, before we knew all these behind the scenes, like, I mean, some of the things that John F. Kennedy was doing, if that was on social media, then he would be quote unquote canceled for a lot of this. I think just
in the White House.
Yes.
He was doing it in the White House.
Yes. So like just the sheer volume is just going to overwhelm the system where like, okay, everybody's got dirt. And Trump has used this, for better or worse, to great effect of like, they're attacking me with so much stuff that none of it's going to stick. And so in his mind, it just kind of inoculates him against kind of any of these kind of charges. So we've got a couple listener questions to wrap up, just a couple minutes here. Thank you everybody for sticking through the hour. From Michael D, if you could handpick 4 presidential candidates to be on the debate stage, what would be the most interesting combination?
So they'd have to be candidates who are in the race currently.
He didn't specify, but I'll say yes.
Okay. I don't have to, I can't pick. This is not like, who would you like to dine with? 3 people you like to have dinner with, dead or alive. Look, I think if you're looking at the polls, clearly you want to have Donald Trump, who has not agreed to attend the debates, but you got to have Donald Trump at these debates. Ron DeSantis clearly is somebody who you want to see. And I got to pick 2 more. Well, Chris Christie and Mike Pence, 2 different approaches to being critical of Trump. Christie more on the personal and kind of moral failings, and Pence more on the political and ideological. They're making their cases. It seems restrictive to restrict it just 4. I don't mind multiple candidates on the stage. It's just when you're getting to like 10, that's a little ridiculous. But those are my 4.
Audrey, that's pretty similar to mine. Do you have a different? What would make the most interesting kind of dust ups?
I think I would have the same exact answer as Mike, except I would replace. I'm not endorsing any of these candidates.
You are an independent journalist, of course.
But I think I would replace Pence with Ramaswamy because I just find him so fascinating. I saw him speak at the Georgia Republican Party convention, and he's just like a Carrie Lake-esque person where he just loves to hear himself talk, and it's just.
I was going to say, you know who else thinks he's super fascinating is himself.
Yeah, exactly.
But no, it's I mean, I think he hit double digits in polling this week. So it's a little early to be peaking, and he might not be peaking. Maybe he's just this is the lowest he'll be from here on out. But
could be.
We shall see. Another question from Charles Burnett asking if any of you are hearing any rumblings of more challenges to President Biden on the Democratic side, or are they pretty much just rolling with what they've got? Obviously, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Marianne Williamson, who has fired, I think, like 6 campaign managers over the past 3 months. So I don't even know if that's a real campaign anymore. But what are you either of you hearing on the Democratic side?
I haven't heard much buzz about that, but I do think that competition is good, and I think that there absolutely should be more people who are challenging him. But that's just kind of the nature of the Democratic Party, where I feel like Republicans are a little bit feistier, whereas Democrats are more likely to fall in line. And obviously, he's the incumbent. But yeah, there's the age issue, and I think that that's going to continue to make itself known over the next few months.
I mean, I don't think there's any appetite for it on the Democratic side. If there were, there'd be another serious challenger. Democrats, for better or for worse, from their perspective, they're going to stick with Biden, and they may not be wrong to do that. I mean, for all of Biden's struggles in the polls, there are some early signs that the fundamentals are pretty strong for him, and changing horses midstream in the Democratic Party would be maybe seen as a sign of weakness.
Yeah. And I think one thing that stood out to me just real quick is when Biden announced his reelection campaign, his team was really smart to roll that out with a video of a bunch of really high profile Democrats, including like popular Democratic governors from southern states, just to show like, hey, like these are people who could run for president but aren't and are getting behind us.
Yeah, so Gavin Newsom was in there, Gretchen Whitmer was in there, I think J.B. Pritzker was in there in Illinois. Yeah, that's kind of the field right there. It's there've been a couple stories lately. I think Jonathan Martin in Politico had one this week about like that you can kind of tell that there's some positioning for 2028 going on behind the scenes of like Gretchen Whitmer isn't running for president in 2024, but if she had, she would have been a very strong candidate, and blah,
yes.
blah, 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 blah. I wonder how that story gets written, but you're seeing a lot of that already. Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, the new governor, positioning.
You know who nobody's talking about for that, by the way, Declan? Kamala Harris.
Yes.
The sitting vice president. That's another signal that Democrats are ready to move beyond her.
Yes. So on that note, we've hit 9:00. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for the hour. And thank you, Mike and Audrey, for being here, and Kevin during the first 30 minutes. And we will be back. Some formulation of us and people who are not here will be on your video screens in about a week, minus an hour. And we'll see you then.